Good morning and welcome. I am Michael Kessler, the Managing Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our speakers, to panelists, and to you, our audience. Today's program promises us all an engaging discussion of the moral and ethical challenges inherent in crafting and implementing national environmental policies and negotiating global compacts like the Paris Climate Covenant. Today's colloquium is one in a series of events that Berkley Center is sponsoring this fall on the environment as part of the Global Futures Project. And I send a warm welcome from Tom Banchoff, the director of the Berkley Center and vice president for global engagement at the university. 2 weeks ago, Georgetown hosted Secretary of State John Kerry as part of his Our Ocean, One Future initiative, a multi-year international undertaking. Last year, the State Department and the Berkley Center co-hosted an event at Georgetown engaging religious actors and NGO leaders on the challenges of climate change and the ways government and NGO actors can work together on addressing and mitigating climate change. There are other events planned for the fall. I would encourage you to check out the website. The Climate Compact agreed to in Paris in 2015 and the degradation of the oceans are only two of the largest issues where environment touches on other issues. Today's record refugee flows are expected to grow as a result of sea rise. Environmental refugees present new challenges at a time when the existing refugee regime is already collapsing. We in the US have already had our own environmental displaced population in Alaska, where Alaskan natives have migrated inland from the coast. Major cities like Miami and Norfolk are also affected by sea level rise. To meet sustainable development goals, including the elimination of poverty by 2030, fresh water supplies will need to be preserved and developed and alternative methods of agriculture fostered. A troubled global environment affects a wide range of policies. Both national and international governance structures have only begun to integrate more fully a concern for ecology into our approaches to both global and national challenges. In the past, we might have overlooked the impact of policies in the environment, but no longer. Today, it is nearly impossible to discuss security, energy, or poverty strategies without considering their environmental dimensions. I would add to that antimicrobial resistance as a cross-cutting challenge that affects both the environment, health care, environment, income inequality, and national and international policy. Pope Francis, in his recent encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home, issued in 2015, promotes a holistic view of our world focused on what he calls, quote, an integral ecology. He says, quote, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis that is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. To practice integral ecology, Pope Francis urges us to adopt a strategy of dialogue. By engaging in dialogue with and among various sectors of society, we can work to meet the challenges of creating a globally sustainable social and economic system that both respects nature and humans. Our hope is that our discussions today with our plenary speakers and panelists, distinguished thinkers each one, will model that kind of dialogue and particularly illustrate how it may take place among policymakers with different responsibilities, values, and interests. In the long term, we would like to think these discussions might lead to the formulation of deep moral principles and frameworks that are useful for environmental policymakers in the way, for instance, the just war tradition has provided a standard set of questions for the articulation of military policy and guidance of personnel in the field. A premise of this colloquium is that every policy decision is a moral decision, because every policy decision reflects upon a range of values at work in American society. It is also a premise of the colloquium that ethics are often not at the center of a conscious reflection in government policymaking. Our hope is that today's conversations will make more articulate the most often inexplicit moral dimension of the policy process and thereby help make them a more conscious part of the policy process. Let me offer a personal word of welcome to all of our presenters and especially to our plenary speakers. Sean Casey, a great friend of the Berkley Center who accepted yet another invitation from us, the second this week. We co-hosted with the State Department the Religion and Diplomacy Conference, and we held the second day of panels at Georgetown. Augusto Zampini, who had to skip a meeting in Rome to be with us, and to Tony Annette, who has come from that same meeting in Rome, not only to be with us, but especially to take on the onerous role of rapporteur, who will sum up the lessons of the day and identify the questions which we and others will have to take up in the future. My hope is that you find it both intellectually stimulating and practically helpful as we endeavor to care for our common home. Now let me introduce my friend and colleague, Drew Christensen, who is Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Global Development at Georgetown School of Foreign Service and is co-director in the Berkley Center of the Program on Church in the World, where he is a senior research fellow. A former editor of the Jesuit Weekly America and director of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office of International Justice and Peace, Drew has also taught social ethics and peace studies at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley and the University of Notre Dame, where he was a founding staff member of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Active in ecumenical and interfaith affairs, Christensen has been a member of the USCCB's Catholic-Jewish Dialogue, has served on the U.S. 7th round of the Catholic United Methodist Dialogue on Eucharist and Creation, and is a member of the first International Catholic Mennonite Dialogue, which issued the groundbreaking report Called Together to be Peacemakers. As well, he has worked with colleagues at Notre Dame, at Boston College, and at the Nuclear Threat Initiative to readdress and reframe the debate around the threat of nuclear security in our challenging times. With that, please join me in welcoming Father Drew Christensen.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to all of you this morning for coming out on this rainy day to join with us, and what I hope will be a really rich day of conversation. We have three plenary speakers, as you heard Michael say. Sean Casey to start us off, talking about religion and policymaking. We have Augusto Zampini, who's going to talk about, who's an Argentinian priest working with CAFOD, the development agency of the Catholic Bishops of England and Wales, and who's had a lot of experience working with the church in the third world on these issues of environment, and where their message is very fresh, and where the hurts of environmental degradation are very real. And finally, Anthony Arnett from Columbia University's Earth Institute has been a collaborator with the Holy See in the development of its policy towards COP21 in Paris, now COP22. That's the meeting he just came from, and a frequent commentator on environmental issues, especially in Commonweal magazine. Tony has taken on the job of listening and trying to draw everything together today so that we'll be able to have, if you will, a kind of platform from which we can move and continue this dialogue in the year and years ahead. I'm very pleased to introduce Sean Casey as our opening plenary speaker. Sean is a great friend of the Center and of Georgetown. This is the third event he's done here in the last week and a half. He's a social ethicist Christian social ethicist by training and by practice. I think he's looking forward to the end of his time in government service so he can resume that kind of work. And he's really the founding director of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of State in the State Department. It really has been a great challenge for him to come and pull together all the activities that related to religion and to interact with the various parts of the State Department. A really novel kind of enterprise. It's the kind of enterprise we're trying to encourage here by getting people across different departments and agencies to talk to one another, and people in different sectors to talk to one another about how policy is made and the way in which values affect their interaction and the kinds of ethical problems they uncover and try to resolve in the process of policy making. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Sean Casey.
Thank you very much, Drew. I'm going to have to work very hard. I have a very small print and it's very dark up here, so please forgive me. The glare on my trifocals is a bit of a challenge. Let me begin by saying I was talking to Carly beforehand, and I said, given my 3 visits here, I think I'm probably eligible for a guest worker status or something here at the Berkley Center. But it's always a delight to be here. I love your mission, and I love the way it's nestled within the larger mission of this great university. The irony, as I was preparing my remarks, is the realization that for the 25 years I was a student and a professor, I was always thinking about the role of the church in the world from the standpoint of the church and as a theological ethicist, trying to engage public policy. And for the last 3 years, I'm on the other end of that. I'm inside the beast, if you will, doing public policy and then trying to bring in religious voices to interact, to shape our policy and to promote our policy and create a kind of conversation on a variety of fronts. I'm not going to try to synthesize that. I'm going to really talk about my perch from within the State Department. And in the question and answer period, if we have time, maybe we can begin to bridge the gap. I will have some remarks about how we've interacted with a variety of religious groups leading up to COP21 and what I argue was actually a very successful framework that we built. But I look forward to the question and answer period. There's light if I hold it up here, so this is going to look a little strange, but I've got to do this to be able to see it. For the past 3 years, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs has sought to enhance the capacity of U.S. foreign policymakers to grapple with religious matters, to advise the Secretary on policy matters as they relate to religion, assisting U.S. officials abroad in their efforts to assess religious dynamics and engage with religious actors, and provide a first point of entry for individuals, both religious and secular, who would like to engage the State Department on any aspect of foreign policy. There are a number of policy areas where the importance of engaging religion is self-evident. For example, it would come as no surprise that a nuanced understanding of interreligious dynamics is of value to diplomats working with communities shaped by sectarian conflict. However, a core principle of our approach at the intersection of religion and foreign policy has been to try and remain attentive to issue areas other than those that are conventionally connected or seen as being connected to religion. And in fact, many of our successes have flowed from this perspective, including anti-corruption efforts in Nigeria, support for organizations involved in refugee resettlement, as well as our participation in public health campaigns to fight the spread of Zika, Ebola, and to develop an effective response or set of responses to the antimicrobial resistance we're seeing around the world. Climate change, I would argue, is another one of those issues. That is one that's not always seen or recognized as having immediate linkages with religion or religious actors. But since the earliest days after Secretary Kerry charged me with leading this office, global environmental issues, and climate change in particular, have figured centrally in our efforts to articulate the policy benefits of engaging religious actors. Among an audience like this one, the threat we face from climate change is very well understood. I don't need to make that case to you. There is a clear scientific consensus reflected in statements from virtually every national scientific academy and professional organization. The human-caused climate change is already producing significant impacts and extraordinary future risks to society and its natural systems. Many of these impacts, like the bleaching of coral reefs or the disappearance of glaciers and depletion of other freshwater sources, disproportionately impact the world's poorest and most vulnerable communities. This is recognized throughout the State Department. Though scientists have been effective in sounding the alarm about climate change, the problem is no longer simply a scientific or technical problem. It is also a political, economic, and social challenge, and above all, a moral issue. This underscores the critical role of the world's faith communities in providing a moral compass with which to comprehend and ultimately to act on this global challenge. Religious leaders and organizations were critical to the international efforts to generate an ambitious, consensus-driven agreement about how to reduce global carbon emissions and expedite the transition towards a low-carbon future. They've also been tireless champions of the world's poor and are working to help those communities adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change. Many of these impacts, such as the more frequent droughts and deluges that have profoundly disrupted food and water supplies, and rising sea levels that flood low-lying communities with greater frequency, disproportionately impact the world's poorest and most vulnerable communities. These, in turn, trigger migration and displacement, exacerbating stresses on fragile governance systems. As the international community has moved to meet the threat of climate change, religious leadership has helped keep us mindful of the communities most vulnerable to its impacts and help sustain our will to provide future generations with unfettered access to the beauty and goodness of the earth on which we all depend. For instance, in his encyclical last year, Pope Francis cited the physical harm being done by climate change to our forests, our oceans, our polar regions, and the economic harm to those who depend for a living on agriculture and marine resources. Echoing this message, religious leaders from a wide range of traditions urge us every day to pursue the common good. In this case, good means a revolution in energy production and consumption that can preserve our environment and create millions of new jobs. I'm sure today many people will focus on the galvanizing effect of the Pope's activity and his encyclical across an astonishing array of both secular and religious communities. So my aim today is to tell you briefly about a story about the work of our office, which we have done with regards to climate change, describing the value of partnerships with religious organizations and capturing the ways religious ideals and religious leaders contribute to the overarching international effort to meet this pressing challenge. In the year leading up to the historic meeting last December in Paris of the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, often called the UNFCCC, which itself is a mouthful, which the United States and almost every country in the world belongs to, our office, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, hosted a series of briefings and consultations with religious stakeholders and helped substantially advance the conversation about religious engagement with climate change policy. A consensus of the parties at that international meeting approved the landmark Paris Agreement on climate change. So in early 2015, not long after we began to staff up, we launched a series of dialogues with a roundtable event that brought together representatives of the two State Department bureaus charged with leading our climate change policy. That is Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs and the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change, with representatives of both secular climate or environmental NGOs and religiously affiliated environmental groups. Though our primary aim in that conversation was to help raise awareness about the UNFCCC process and to provide information about the Obama administration's approach to the negotiation to a diverse array of faith groups, we also wanted to assess whether and what gaps existed between the secular and religious environmental advocacy communities. Based on my prior scholarly work, I intuited that there were distances between those three communities, even though they shared similar ambitions for a successful Paris negotiations. There was distance, there was disagreement, there was not consensus in different directions between these three parties. These groups were generally aware of each other's unique contributions, but sometimes treated one another with some suspicion. Let me just say that's a very highly diplomatically crafted sentence. I could go into greater depth in building that map out about the feelings in every direction, but because I'm still a diplomat for the next 4 months, I'm not going to do that for you. So this unlikely alliance was met with challenges from all sides. However, both the faith-based organizations and the environmental NGOs were united in their desire that the international community, and the U.S. government in particular, take the necessary steps to achieve a broad, ambitious agreement. There was a lot of suspicion towards the Obama administration for both of these two camps, that we might be willing to back away from as strong agreement as possible in Paris. and that was expressed very early in our conversations. United by their goal to see a strong agreement and emboldened by their access to the determined U.S. officials working on climate change, the NGOs and the faith-based organizations were better able to appreciate their complementary approaches. So they were able to actually address some of the tension between the two environmental sectors as a result of coming into our conversation. Now, conversations like this one and similar ones followed throughout the course of 2015, and they helped to build a robust dialogue among these stakeholders. And looking back on what we achieved in this and subsequent meetings, I'm proud of the degree to which our leading climate policymakers valued their engagement with these religious communities in particular. The Special Envoy for Climate Change at the time, Todd Stern, who was our lead climate change negotiator, once said, "There was real interest among religious groups to understand climate science and policy, as well as the need for government officials to engage all segments of civil society, including religious communities, to inspire action on global environmental issues." I found myself in a line standing next to Todd Stern at a large senior leadership meeting, and as we were throwing salad and sandwiches and potato chips on our plates, he turned to me and said, "Sean, your office is doing amazing work." And I have to confess, I didn't know Todd Stern knew my name or knew what our office did. And he went on to say, it was his belief that in terms of civil society engagement, if we were going to be successful convincing the American public that whatever came out of Paris was a good thing, we needed to convince the business community, the security community, and he said perhaps most importantly, the religious community of the United States. I wanted to put down my plate and say, my work here is done. I can go back to academia because indeed, in what was at that point probably the most pressing social justice issue in the world, the man leading our negotiation had learned from the input that had come into his office from the conversation with the faith-based groups that attended so many of our conferences. Perhaps the most visible of our engagement efforts on climate change was our symposium on religion and climate change that we did here in October at Georgetown, October 2015. Just on the eve, actually it was in November, I'm sorry, can't read my own print here, on the eve of the Paris conference of the parties, as between the State Department and Georgetown. This two-day event drew from a wide circle of expertise, including theological perspectives, scholarly voices, representations from faith-based organizations, secular environmental groups, and government officials from a wide swath of federal agencies. Many months of the effort, culminating in the symposium, helped ensure that religious leaders had information about our climate policy that was necessary for their enlightened contributions to the success of Paris. The powerful example set by Pope Francis is well known, but American religious leaders from a wide variety of traditions, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and Sikh, worked in parallel to mobilize their communities to help achieve the strong agreement in Paris. The Paris Agreement, I think, gives us reason for hope, if not optimism. The framework of the Paris Agreement requires that the international community maintain its resolve and offer increasingly ambitious mitigation targets every 5 years going forward. The international community is addressing aspects of climate change in other international bodies, notably the Montreal Protocol, which was established to address threats to the ozone layer. It's working on measures to reduce production and the use of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, which are more powerful greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide in affecting climate change. The International Civil Aviation Organization is addressing emissions for international travel, an issue that's being negotiated in this very week. And the International Maritime Organization is working on measures concerning greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping sector. In the post-Paris era, then, policymakers are turning to concrete, specific domains of climate policy, working to identify ways to implement and achieve the promises made in Paris. In this shift towards implementation, the Green Climate Fund has a critical role to play by providing support to developing countries to advance their climate change objectives. The Green Climate Fund, which is managed through an independent secretariat, has over $10 billion in pledged contributions. As the largest contributor to the Green Climate Fund in terms of pledged contributions and paid-in resources to date, the U.S. sees the Green Climate Fund is critical to leverage private sector capital flows to catalyze climate mitigation and adaptation results on the ground. The Office of Religion and Global Affairs has, over the past year, regularly convened religious groups for briefings on the Green Climate Fund, which have helped various religious networks to support the fund and enhance its efficacy. In keeping with our mission to serve as a point of access for religious communities, we've sought to provide space for faith-based organizations to orient themselves to a complex and still evolving policy and fiscal apparatus. Given the effective work that many religious organizations do at the grassroots level, where they serve as critical providers of humanitarian relief and development assistance, engagement with the Green Climate Fund is a logical step for many faith-based organizations. For a specific set of religious organizations that have climate-focused lines of effort, those that provide relief services after natural disasters, those that work with farmers to develop adaptive capacity, and those that advance resilient infrastructure projects, we're helping coordinate briefings about how they can get directly involved with the Green Climate Fund. As the policy community works increasingly to incorporate climate change and climate risk across multiple sectors, from public health to infrastructure development, the approach we have taken to religious actor mapping may also be of significant value. Nuanced contextual analyses of religious dynamics and an understanding of the range of religious actors operating in different local environments can be tremendously useful information for policymakers. It's important to note then, by way of conclusion, that the approach we have taken to engaging religious actors on environmental policies issues is not limited to just climate change. Similar opportunities to develop partnerships with religious stakeholders on a host of other issues await, and we see our work in this space expanding to include marine conservation issues, international efforts to combat illegal mining, fishing and logging, wildlife trafficking, and clean energy development. So let me stop there. Did I leave any time for question and answers? Okay. So I will try to call on you through the Klieg lights if you want to throw any questions at me. So please. Yes.
Thank you for your perspectives that you've offered and for talking to us about the great work that the State Department is doing. One of the topics that's emerged in the international community with regard to climate change is loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change. And it seems to me that it does have a strong ethical dimension to it. And I was just wondering what faith-based organizations, what their perspective is on that topic, and just any other commentary related to that.
Well, I'm hardly in a position to speak for faith-based organizations. That's something I have to be very careful about. Certainly, that is going to be an expanding issue with sea level rise and a host of other, crop failure and things like that. That strikes me as just diabolically complex. I think that's going to be an issue that is only going to be addressed again, in an analogous set of conversations to what we had leading up to Paris, although those conversations may be even more complicated than the Paris discussions were. I see no simple formula for that. I think that's going to be a very complicated, global, vexed, fraught set of conversations. So that's a long, lousy answer to a great question. Marianne?
I wonder if you could just expand on the comments you made at the end. You made 2 points that the Religion and Global Affairs Office is doing this mapping of religious actors, very important for policymakers' engagement, and that engagement wouldn't just be limited to climate change, but on other issue areas as well. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about both of those, and also with the question of engagement on other issues. With climate change, you had COP21 kind of driving the boat, so there was something on the horizon that you had a need to engage. Do you see any other vehicles like that, whether it's legislative or international, that could drive the boat to encourage, in a time frame, engagement on those issues?
Well, we've also negotiated climate agreements with individual countries, bilateral treaties or bilateral instruments. I think that will continue. There's no reason, simply because we have COP in place, that in the UNFCCC, there's no reason why the kind of one-on-one country negotiations cannot and will not. I think they will. I think the model with China was really quite interesting. So I would expect there still to be international diplomatic initiative and energy towards these more country-to-country kinds of understandings, whether they be formal treaties or other kinds of agreements. In terms of mapping, you know, I have a staff of 30 brilliant people. We have over 20 graduate degrees in religion or a cognate field. So I've been very fortunate to be able to build a staff. As you can imagine, the complexities of religion and global affairs would tax even a staff of 30 really smart people. When you think about a planet with 7 billion people and the amazing complex ways that religious communities interact in their social environment, we have to be very, very focused in what we do and what we don't do. The problem is there are too many issue areas to get involved in. So we've tried to develop some internal criteria to help us sort, well, why do we choose issue A, but we don't invest in issue B? And sometimes those are the most heart-rending discussions we go through in our suite. The ability to say no to something that might be morally compelling is very, very wrenching from my leadership position. But we've had to develop these kind of criteria about how we sort issues. One of them is where is it in terms of the administration's list of diplomatic priorities? And then secondly, where does it sit on the secretary's list of priorities? I work in his bureau. He is my boss. So even one of the first things you learn is try to keep your boss happy, right? So we try to align our limited resources with those kinds of criteria. But in the aftermath of COP21, Evan Barry, who is leading our initiatives in my office and is sitting right next to you, Marion, has helped us go through a very hard decision about where do we invest our energy on the environment. And the Green Climate Fund immediately popped up, and I agreed with Evan's analysis. It was not an argument we had. I mean, he persuaded me without a lot of energy, because this global fiscal funding source, I believe, and I think Evan shares this, is going to be moving capital, both public and private, towards climate mitigation and adaptation efforts on the ground. And if those efforts are not successful, we're not going to meet the carbon emission standards that were agreed to. So we felt like this is a compelling place for us to help faith-based organizations understand the emerging financial infrastructure that's being implemented around the world. Because if the money flow goes to the right places, we have a much higher degree of or chance of being successful. So that's where we decided to go down. But then I read you that list of other areas where people have come to us, embassies and posts have come to us and said, well, can you help us with wildlife trafficking? And it turns out there is actually some very interesting religious dimensions to wildlife trafficking around the world. So we had to be very pragmatic. We've tried to develop really clear, but once we do, let's say, for instance, we do embrace wildlife trafficking, understanding the impact and interaction of several religious communities in that sector is going to be crucial to success. We have that capacity to go to Africa and see if there is religiously driven demand for wildlife trafficking. And I think that there's a case to be made for that. So we've got a research and analysis capacity where if we decide we're going to work in a space, we go in and we try to do a landscape exercise to tell our policymakers, these are the religious actors that we need to interact with. These are the dynamics of their presence in this policy sector. So that's the specialty that we bring to our partners in the State Department. So I hope that helps. Yes, sir.
Can you say something? I know this. Hi, I'm Jeff Burnham at Georgetown. Can you say something, without being undiplomatic, about the difference between how different religious groups approach climate change? We're all familiar with Pope Francis, but are there Protestant leaders or Hindu leaders, or pick one, who approach this differently because of the tenets of their own religion?
Well, I'll halfway answer that question. All right? I'm not going to name a particular person, but different religious traditions bring different theological resources to bear. They also bring different experiences to that, and they also bring different understandings of the policy process. I mean, so I have engaged with religious communities that assume the liberal nation state is the problem. Full stop. Okay. And they're talking to somebody who works for the government of a liberal nation state, okay? So I've sometimes been on the receiving end of their wrath that you guys are the problem. Now, again, my job is to be a diplomat, and part of that is what we call playing the piñata, right? My job is not to move you off your bad theology, even though there's a part of my brain screaming, yes, Sean, do that, go there, okay? But as a diplomat, people get twitchy around me when I start, doing this kind of theological engagement. So religious communities begin, now, Catholic social teaching has a view of the state, a very sophisticated, historically developed view, but it's not the same as some other traditions whose experiences and views are different about the role of the nation state. So I have to then be flexible, and what we were trying to do, frankly, was to look for an overlapping consensus between an astonishing array of religious actors who come from different theological, experiential viewpoints. I decided early on we were not going to come to a theological religious consensus across the dozens of groups that walked into the room, and my time would be ill-invested to offer my own personal theological viewpoint to try to find a thick consensus there. So that makes it very difficult when you're sitting in a room of people who start from very different political, theological, and experiential origins. So what we did was essentially see where was the overlap was essentially everybody wanted to get the best agreement we could out of Paris, even though some religious groups at the table thought we were going to sell out. We, the United States government, were going to sell out and give the game away before it started. So there was not always a lot of confidence in the room. But I am happy to say, I think by the time we had the Georgetown event here in November, we had found, I think, that overlapping consensus. Now, that's not to say that every religious actor in the room applauded everything that was in the Paris Agreement. That's not the truth at all. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question. I'm not going to give you like Exhibit A, but just take my word for it. There was incredible diversity in the room. Now, the other piece of it was, too, some of the groups, it was just like, God created the world, so let's just all do a bear hug, kumbaya, and let those guys in Paris write the toughest agreement. And they didn't care about the policy details. So there was a range of policy sophistication in the room. Now, there were other people, other religious groups that were as articulate in terms of the weeds as our environmental specialists who were working on the negotiations. And so some of our policy people were blown away by the technical knowledge of the religious communities. But I would say that knowledge, the depth of that knowledge varied radically across the religious platforms as well. So it was really an amazing lack of consensus other than the fact people wanted to get the toughest treaty possible. Walt, you?
Hi, Walt Grazer here at Georgetown. To play off of just where you were, we're trying to look at the kind of ethical dimensions of policy and kind of the conflicts policymakers make. It seems to me there's probably, safe to say, with cost-benefit analysis, a heavy utilitarian way of thinking about this in policy circles to make decisions. So, and given this kind of variety, as you said, of religious, we'll call it narratives and so forth, and even secular ethical narratives, can you get an ethical discussion going in those kinds of things, or a way of exposing what the underlying ethical visions and policies are? Is there a way to do that, or is that kind of a nice fantasy to have, but we're not going to be able to do that?
Well, it seems to me that's the beauty of a context like this one. Okay, sitting where I sat, we started our conversations with less than 12 months before the Paris meeting. That did not give me time to do a tutorial to bring together, to create a moral consensus. One of the most poignant moments in our Religion and Diplomacy conference earlier this week was when Michael Gilligan of the Luce Foundation, who many of you know, we had a group of philanthropies at a lunch, and I asked each one of them to talk about sort of what they did in the space of religion and global affairs, but then also what are your anxieties, what are your fears? And Michael, at the end of this amazing discussion, and those of you who know, Luce is probably the leading philanthropy in this space. Michael, who's a very strong, balanced, amazing human being, was on the verge of choking up. He was sitting next to me, and I noticed, and he said one of the great failures is exactly this, to build a moral consensus, both in this country but also globally, on why we need to address climate change. Now, the State Department's ability to build moral consensuses is frankly a little threadbare, right? Let's be honest, that we were not known for doing that because the world's on fire and we're bailing every day because we're overwhelmed. But this is precisely the location at a Jesuit university like this, and at the Berkley Center, as Drew and Michael were talking about, where you can do the long, hard work of not only trying to build a conversation to get to that consensus, but you're also educating an amazing student body on a regular basis. That's a mission fit more for the church, for religious groups, and for universities than it is for those of us who are killing ourselves in the policy process. Then you can educate the policy makers as well. And I think that's, when you're a senior leader in the State Department, you don't have a lot of bandwidth, frankly, for developing a moral vision. But we're open to hearing that. I'm open to being trained by people who come in. So I think this is the great need. And it's why I'm going to go back to academia. It's why I'm not going to stay as a policymaker for the rest of my career, because in many ways this discussion that you just highlighted is as important or more important than the policy discussion. Catherine?
I was at another conference yesterday, and somebody asked me a question which sort of surprised me. They said faith groups are way behind on other topics and other groups and communities in addressing climate change issues. I know that the narrative of the World Council of Churches, the Orthodox churches, the whole indigenous rights is we were there far, far before anyone else. So I'd be curious if you'd be willing to make any sort of comment on what parts of the advocacy and intellectual and moral arguments that some of these groups see themselves making have been most effective. I know there's ARC, which uses Buckingham Palace as their sort of tea room, and countless other efforts. What seems to make a difference?
Well, in the best of all possible worlds, it's advocacy that comes from religious communities whose grassroots are part of the process. I think just to be blunt, part of the problem, at least in the United States, and I have to be very careful here when I make blanket statements, and to the extent this is a blanket statement, I forgive, but a lot of religious advocacy groups in this town have very, very flimsy connections to the grassroots. And I think that's a problem, because I think there's a cynicism on the Hill towards that kind of advocacy. So in other words, if I'm an advocate for a national religious group and I come in and staffers know that behind me are not hundreds of congregations or thousands of congregants, that they discount that advocacy. And I think in my 16 years here in Washington, D.C., I think increasingly many of the advocacy groups' ties to their own grassroots have frayed. Now, there's some exceptions. Let me be very clear. There are exceptions to that. So this doesn't account for everybody. But I think the most powerful and successful advocacy actors, and at least national policy here, are those that have congregants and members standing behind their advocates here, and they can make their voices heard across the country, not just in Washington, D.C. itself. As many of you know, for 14 years, I taught a seminar at Wesley Theological Seminary looking at the role of advocacy and policymakers here in D.C. So I've spent a lot of hours trudging to all of those offices. I've also spent a lot of hours going to policy people saying, well, what do you hear when organization X comes in or organization Y comes in? So I'm troubled by what I think has happened, that there's been again, some cases, not all cases, there's been a distancing. And part of that is because if you're a clergy person who's climbing into a pulpit on a weekly basis, and I have done that, I know what that's like. How do you move a congregation on climate change? You go into a Christian congregation in Washington, D.C., and in many cases you can assume in your congregation you've got both parties represented, the cultural divide between the two parties is sometimes replicated in your congregation. So how, as a clergy person, how are you going to raise climate change as a compelling moral issue when you know different political parties have very deeply and divergent sets of views? And so I can understand why, as a clergy person, you might say, I'm just going to take a pass on this, because I don't want to feel or field the negative blowback. So part of what I did for the past 14 years was training seminary students on how to go into congregations that represented the diverse polity of the United States and raise these moral issues in a way that might actually lead to progress. And it's a very hard skill set to teach. It's a hard skill set for clergy to master. And I'm not sure all of our advocacy agencies have, I think in response to that, many of them have sort of narrowed their apertures with respect to their own constituent base. So I understand. I think that on the face of it, what you said, and in those spaces, some of the advocacy groups have been there first. But when you look over their shoulders back to their wider religious communities, I don't think that's always reflected in the rank and file. And I think you have to attend to both to be truly effective in your advocacy in this town. So I don't know if that gets at your question or not. But it's a complicated space, to put it mildly. Galen, sorry, couldn't see you there.
Thank you. Galen Carey, the National Association of Evangelicals. You mentioned bandwidth constraints and difficult choices, and of course, religious people face the same constraints and issues. So I'm wondering, if, as people of faith who are deeply concerned for our environment, for world peace and prosperity, what other environmental challenges does our world face that also require ethical and moral and religious interventions, in which, if left unaddressed, would have major consequences?
Wow, that's a great question. I think piggybacking on my last answer, and something we do in our office about, I believe religion is understood in context. I think if you're clergy and you're attached to a mosque, a synagogue, or a congregation, you need to understand the environmental issues in your own zip code. That's one way. I often see that local issues are often a gateway into global issues. As a minister, it was hard for me sometimes to convince people to get interested in global moral issues by talking about what's going on around the world. I mean, that was just a fact in my particular tradition. But if you can point out environmental racism in your own zip code, that's people see that because it's right in front of them. That often local issues or local examples of a global issue can be the moral gateway, the pedagogical, catechetical gateway, if you will, for a community into the larger. So you take an organization, and here I'm in trouble because I'm starting to name organizations. I think Bread for the World, for instance, toggles between sort of domestic initiatives and then international issues. They go from year to year. Now, sometimes they break that pattern because there might be a particular pressing issue. But I do believe that looking at local forms of environmental degradation or challenge can often be a way to energize a local community. And then somebody says, well, oh my goodness, it's not just in Northern Virginia that we have problem with water runoff and then flash flooding as a result of overdevelopment. And then people's moral windows open and the horizons expand. So that's one technique, I think, frankly, for religious communities to consider. And sometimes that's what lights people up morally. And then 5 years later, they're talking about the global extension of whatever the local issue was that presented itself. So that's one technique. So certainly, for some people, and I think this is part of the problem in trying to convince at least Christians, and I'm come from the Christian tradition, climate change looks abstract. Sea level rise is not a big deal in Abilene, Texas, right? It's hard to convince people you've got some skin in that game because it's distant and it's abstract. And so sometimes you have to find concrete local expressions of whatever the policy issue is. That's the way then to begin to point people outwardly into a wider world. And certainly there are enough local environmental problems in our own country.
Time for one more question.
One more? David.
David Hollenbach here at Georgetown. Something that has, thank you. David Hollenbach at Georgetown. I've done a lot of work on the idea of the common good. And you mentioned the term early on in your initial presentation. And it seems to me that sort of environmental integrity is a common good like almost no other one, because it's there for everybody, or it's not there at all. Mm-hmm. And there have been a lot of analyses of American society and culture and so forth that have argued that we have this very individualistic culture, and that our religions tend to be very individualistic, maybe not so much Catholicism, but certainly the Protestant traditions are strong. I'm wondering if you see ways in which the discussions about climate change and other environmentally challenging issues are affecting the value systems here in this country to become more aware of the shared goods that are there for us all, or there across not just individual goods that are divided up into, and if so, whether the religious communities can continue to advance that. I mean, the reason I'm asking this is because I'm trying to find an avenue into which I could sort of bring some of this idea of the common good into the discussion of this whole range of set of issues. And it seems to me that it ought to be able to be done, but I'm interested in whether you think it's beginning to happen, whether there are serious obstacles to that, and so forth. That's more looking at it from your standpoint there at the State Department, but if you want to speak theologically, I'd be very happy to hear that too.
Sure. No. And to me, that is one of the central moral challenges, particularly in the United States. I mean, this tension between sort of individualism versus communitarianism. In my own history, in one aspect of frankly almost my entire life, is water. I was born within a stone's throw and grew up within a stone's throw of the Mississippi River until I left home and forsook the water and moved to West Texas, which is another story. I think the Flint, Michigan story is quite compelling. One of the things that unites all Americans and all communities is sort of this assumption: we turn a spigot, we get drinkable water. I mean, it was inconceivable for me, even to this day, if I were to walk onto a campus and discover there was no accessible water, there would be a rip in the space-time continuum of my life world. Okay, but Flint shows what happens to a community. So you can be a millionaire and have a home in Flint, or you can be a homeless person in Flint, Michigan, and you are compelled and deeply shaken by what's happened there in terms of water. And I think that example is one of the reasons it's galvanized this country, is just the assumption that everybody has a right to access to water, and most of us do. And so the lack of water or the presence of water unites or divides us. So there's an example where we think about it individualistically until the system that provides us that water collapses and an entire city, its existence is threatened by that lack of community access to the good of potable water. And Catholic social teachings would argue, and as you know far better than I, that citizens of Flint are falling below a threshold of the common good of water. It threatens their dignity, it threatens their existence. That access to potable water ought to be part of one's experience of the common good. So sometimes it's the disruption of the common good that we don't even know is there that is the teaching moment. And I think in many ways what happened in Flint is a parable for the entire infrastructure of this country. We have neglected our infrastructure, whether it's the phone system, whether it's water, whether it's access to food. We have food deserts now all across this country. So the basic fabric of the delivery of the common goods is failing in this country. So I want to believe that, again, it's the common experience of threat and deprivation that suddenly awakens us in the fact there's more to the water system than just the spigot I turn on in my home, but I'm connected to my neighbors and to my town. And it's our river systems that are being threatened. I remember I grew up I was born in southeast Missouri, then at the age of 4, we moved to Paducah, Kentucky, which is where the Tennessee and Ohio River meet, and then they meet the Mississippi about 30 miles downwards. We had a uranium enrichment plant in our town. and they found plutonium in the groundwater. Now, not only, in this case, it wasn't lack of water, but you're turning on the spigot and you're wondering, am I poisoning myself with plutonium? And the existential threat that posed to my community and potentially communities downriver all the way to New Orleans, if in fact this plutonium poisoning was leaking into the river system. So I think part of it is awakening ourselves as Americans to the fact that we are woven together. We are part of a community whether we recognize it or not, even though many of us are trained to be blind to those communities. So I think the infrastructure deterioration, and particularly the poisoning of our water, present opportunities to teach people that indeed we are part of a community. Being part of that community doesn't threaten our individuality. In fact, it helps us be truly, fully human, to recognize we're part of community. So I think theologically, there's a great teaching moment available to religious communities today to just illustrate through some of these unexpected crises, which unfortunately you think are going to be increasing in number given the state of our massive infrastructure at this point. I think there are going to be more stories like Flint. And we know now in our major urban areas the growth of food deserts and things like that. So while I lament the state of our infrastructure, I do see opportunities for teaching voices to begin to address the fact that we are part of a community, and we need to think of the common good in a way that historically many of us have not been attentive to. So I'm sorry for that long, meandering answer, but
Chairman, I want to thank you. I bring back that lesson for my class next week. And you've demonstrated not only that in 3.5 years you've become a very successful diplomat, but that John Kerry has merited and confidence in putting you to be the leader of this new enterprise of the office. Thank you very much.
well, thank you so much. It's been great to be here.